Hello and welcome to the Trail and Adventure Motorbike Podcast with me, Clive Barber, and my good mate, Noel Tom. For the days when you can't ride your bike, there's always the Trail and Adventure Motorbike Podcast. Welcome back, chaps, to another exciting episode of the Trail and Adventure Motorbike Podcast. This week, we are delighted to be joined by Gordon G. May. Gordon is a frequent overlander. He's done lots of different trips all over the world, and he is a Royal Enfield aficionado. He was introduced to us by our new best friend at Royal Enfield, Mark Wells, and officially, Gordon is the Royal Enfield historian. He has many Royal Enfields. He's a fascinating chap. It's a great talk. I hope you enjoy it. Let's get on with it.
I've got one in my lounge, I've got one in my spare bedroom, and I've got two in pieces in my actual bedroom. You can tell I live on my own.
So have any of them made it upstairs?
Yes. Oh, blimey, yeah. So I've got a 1949 350 Royal Enfield Bullet that's in my lounge. Yeah, that had to be hefted up the stairs, two flights with strong friends. It's a lot easier taking them down, I've got to say. So in 2008, I rode a 500 Bullet, a 1953 500 Bullet, overland to India from here to the original Tedavotio Royal Enfield factory in Chennai. And that was completely reassembled and restored inside this apartment. And the day came where it finally had to get down to terra firma. I knocked on a neighbour's door. I knew he went to the gym because he was wore a tight T-shirt. He was very muscly. And I said, "Could you give me a hand, please? I've got something I need to move out of my flat." "Yeah, of course." I'd manoeuvred the bike to the door by this point, and the look on his face when he saw it.
I think all men, if they were single and had a number of motorcycles and didn't have a garage, would bring them inside, wouldn't they?
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. Why not? I tell you, it's the best place you can restore a motorcycle. A garage, unless you are blessed, as Noel appears to be there, with a very smart-looking space. Is it heated?
Yeah, it is heated.
Oh, look at that. See, I would say most people's garages are not. And, middle of winter and it's freezing cold. Do you really want to go and spend half an hour tinkering in your garage? Whereas, if it's in your living room, even if you haven't got time to work on it, you can be looking at it and thinking about what you're going to do next. And if you've only got 20 minutes, it's just there. You don't need to get all your warm winter clothes on and brace the elements to get into your garage. It's just there and you can do things.
You never start them in the house. They always go outside for the first kick.
Well,
You do.
it's a very small apartment block, and there have been a couple of occasions where I've checked outside and there's no cars, which means there's nobody else home. And I've opened the window and...
That's brilliant. I love that.
Yeah, the spare bedroom used to have 4 bikes, like a mini museum, all sort of lined up at its angles, and it was them that I started.
I don't know if you've ever listened to the podcast, Gordon. Have you had a chance to since we've been chatting online?
I did. Obviously, I listened to Mark Wells's 2 podcasts.
He was good.
Oh, Mark's brilliant.
I've actually prepared a Brett Goldstein introduction for you, Gordon, because I thought the various things you do are worthy of a Brett Goldstein introduction. So here we go.
Oh, my goodness.
Well, the last person that got one actually asked for one. So you didn't have to ask for one, which is even better, really. So here we go. He's a motorcycle overland traveller, an author, a historian, a classic bike enthusiast, a mechanic, I'm assuming because you've got the classic bikes, a gentleman, a storyteller, a podcaster. He's the world's foremost expert on Royal Enfield. He's Gordon G. May.
He's got his head in his hands.
I'm left speechless. I did enjoy it, although, I'm radiating heat from my cheeks. Oh, thank you for that. Wow, what a wonderful introduction. I'm really, really flattered. Thank you, guys. I do work for Royal Enfield in the brand team, but I'm also the company historian, which is a really important role because heritage is hugely significant and important to Royal Enfield. I've only actually been an employee properly for the last 3.5 years, but prior to that, I'd worked as a consultant for the best part of 20 years. I've written history books on Royal Enfield and travel books of which only one was on a Royal Enfield, actually. The other two were on a little BSA Bantam and on a wartime matchless 350. And motorcycles seem to dominate my life. They really are my absolute passion.
Let's talk a little bit about your history with motorcycles. When did you first get into motorcycles? Were you influenced by a parent or a relative, or is it something that you got into later in life?
I don't know why I first became attracted to them, but I had a motorcycle at school. So 17, I could ride to school every day on my motorcycle, and there was only other one motorcyclist at school, so that was really cool. I think maybe I thought it would make me attractive to girls, but it never seemed to work like that.
That's not true. You just didn't notice. Motorbikes definitely make you more attractive.
I think my long hair at the time and beard and smelly T-shirts had a lot to do with it not working.
It's the only reason Noel's got a girlfriend is because you've got loads of motorbikes. I can't think of any other reason.
She doesn't know about the motorbikes. What kind of bike was it, Gordon? We need to know that.
It was a Honda CB100N.
Yeah, what colour?
A kind of teal blue.
Oh, that's the one I want.
Podcast Gold, what colour was it? For fuck's sake. We're supposed to be good at this.
It's a classic colour for those Hondas, and it's really rare, isn't it, that teal blue one?
I do occasionally have a look on eBay to see if because I remember the registration number, and I just wonder if one day it will ever show up again.
I've actually got a version of the first bike I ever had, which I bought many years ago to restore for £150. It's a Honda CB125S.
It's a work in progress.
Very long, tired work in progress. What took you from the Honda 100N, CB100N, to a Royal Enfield? Was there a journey in between the 17-year-old and the traveller in later life?
My first British motorcycle, so this would be 1984, was a Royal Enfield Crusader Sports 250. It was the year it was manufactured, the year of my birth, 1963. I just thought it was just the most gorgeous motorcycle at the time. It had an aftermarket alloy racing tank on it and ace bars, and I just thought it was the bee's knees.
But as a young man, what do you think turned you on to older, more sort of classic bikes and not the Japanese stuff?
I think the same as today. I just love the charm and the character of them. It just really appeals to me. I used to dress at that era, once I got rid of the long hair, in sort of 1950s suits from Oxfam shops and trilby hats and kipper ties. It was just my style. And so, the old bikes just kind of fit in with that, really.
Yeah, you had style by the sounds of it.
And so I had this Crusader, and then in 1987 went travelling for a year's journey between the UK and New Zealand. Been in Pakistan for backpacking, been in Pakistan for about 6 weeks, and then crossed the land border into India. Sat at the roadside near Amritsar having a chai on the first day of crossing, and this engine note came first before I even saw a motorcycle. The exhaust, the blue going dum, 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 and this all black 350 Bullet sort of majestically made its way past. And I looked at my girlfriend, we were travelling together, and I said, "We got to do that." And it's a Royal Enfield, and I've got a Royal Enfield. And so from that point onwards, it was just Royal Enfield mad, I guess.
So you don't have anything modern in your collection now or then, I guess?
I've got a new Royal Enfield. Look, I'm so blessed with my work. Wherever I go, I get given motorcycles to ride, new ones. I was listening to Mark Wells' podcast earlier, and he was saying how he's the luckiest man and he's got the best job in the world. But I've got to say, I feel exactly the same.
His job is a lot easier than yours because he supposedly designs Royal Enfields, but all he's doing is just taking the old ones and going, "Here you go.
Another one of these, please."
Don't tell him I said that.
How did it happen with Royal Enfield? Did they come knocking on your door, or?
In 2001, I started a newsletter about Royal Enfields because we had at that time an importer distributor in the UK, Watsonian and Squire, so the world's oldest sidecar manufacturer. They'd started to do some specials and they were getting quite a bit of attention, and the classic bike scene and it was really strong. And so I started this newsletter and I sold it in print form in the UK and internationally by email. It was called The Bulletin. And I did that full time for almost 3 years. But when I started it, pretty soon the factory caught on in India. Their marketing department was tiny for international markets, as were their budgets. So they couldn't support me in any way, but they wanted assistance, which was, for me, it was a thrill. It was great to have this connection with the factory for my fledgling business. I started in April 2001, and in November 2001, I was lucky enough to meet Sid for the first time and interviewed him for an article. Then I began to get requests from them. Can you organize a focus group for this? Can you introduce us to these people? Can you organize that for us? Because we just didn't have strong representation here at all. Obviously, we had our distributor, but we didn't have representation on the ground from India. It just built from there, and then I got an invite to go out to the factory in 2002. Off I went with my camera and tape recorder, and I spent a couple of weeks at the factory, wrote a book about their production there, which I called Made in India. It was a really simple little book. It was mostly photographs of production, because I thought, if you own one of these motorcycles, which is still at that point were pretty much the 1955 design that originally went to India, how wonderful to actually be able to chart its progress down the assembly line. And there was history in it as well, and a bit about the sort of community in India and all the different variations of the model. That relationship with people in Royal Enfield just continued to build from that point onwards.
Sounds like you pretty much worked for them before you worked for them.
I guess by the time I worked for them, because I had a couple of other businesses, they were taking up maybe 50% of my work time. Obviously, I wasn't charging back in 2001, but by then, obviously, I was charging for my time and had been doing for a long time, actually. I've been really blessed by there are some incredible people work for Royal Enfield. It really is like a family in many ways. I love India, and I just seem to click with people in India. I just think they're the most wonderful, wonderful people. And so I've been really blessed with the relationships I've been able to build.
What's a day in the life of a historian for a motorcycle brand?
Well, I do other things as well. But as the historian, gosh, I get all kinds of requests from media around the world who might be writing a story about Royal Enfield, and they'll like a few images to support the heritage. I've just got back from Thailand, actually, so I'll do presentations to the media, to our community, to our dealer network, to build on our heritage, especially in markets where it's not very well known. I mean, to stand here on stage and talk about Royal Enfield's history to British motorcycle journalists, it would be not really beneficial. But to go to markets where I was in Tokyo in March doing the same, where they're really passionate about old British motorcycles and they want to know about the heritage, but they haven't actually been given it in a format that they enjoy working with. And so that's a great pleasure for me to go and do that. I do presentations. So when, as new joiners come into the business, I do history inductions with them. People write to the company with inquiries about their old Royal Enfields, and they want them dating, or they need support to get them registered, so that comes to me. Then there are specific events we organise where heritage becomes a part of it, and I get involved in that, and it's very varied. And sometimes with collaborations, if we're collaborating with a company that's doing something, say with crash helmets, but they want some historic reference in there, then again, I'm called in.
Does Enfield have much of a presence in Japan?
We're relatively new into Japan. We've been in Thailand a lot longer. We've got a CKD line in Thailand, actually, but we're relatively new into Japan. But it's a really exciting market for us because, the custom bikes scene is huge. There's a great, strong following for British motorcycles. Our bikes are brilliant platforms for customization. Just a great opportunity for us to be there.
I've got a question for you as a motorcycle historian, which you may or may not know the answer to. If you don't, I'll just cut it out, don't worry. I'm from Coventry in the Midlands. It's quite near to Redditch anyway, which is where Royal Enfield started, right? What was it about the Midlands that had that wealth of motorcycling and car manufacturing?
It's just been such a strong engineering base, hasn't it? But I've got to say, guys, what does one have to do to become a historian? I get this label as historian, and it's great. I mean, I'm really touched that people call me that. I remember how it came about because, obviously I've written history books about a motorcycle brand. Does that, if you write a history book, does that make you a historian?
Well, it could have something to do with it, I think.
I remember, I think it was back, about 2017. So back in the consultancy days, we were showcasing the new twin platform, which became the Interceptor and the Continental GT 650s, a year ahead of the actual launch. And we brought something like 150 journalists and dealers out from India to see the UK Technology Centre, see what we were doing there and the new 650 engine. I got given the job of taking them in groups around the National Motorcycle Museum. It was exhausting. I think I did 7 tours of an hour long in one day. And it was like trying to herd cats because there was about 30 Royal Enfields in the museum, which of course I want to really show. And there's 800 other British motorcycles. So you can imagine the challenge I had. And I think the following day, then there was this huge dealer meeting at Bruntingthorpe. Sid Lowell was on stage and he said, I hear you all had tours of the museum yesterday. Did you have a great time with Gordon? And some of the audience sort of nodded and said yes. And then he said, doesn't that say something about our brand that we have our own in-house historian? What? Who's that? Oh gosh, is that me? That label's kind of stuck since then.
But you sound as if you're not keen on it.
No, I am. I'm really proud of it. It's just I don't feel, is it imposter syndrome perhaps? I haven't been to university and studied history. I've just written a couple of books about motorcycles that I'm passionate about and can talk endlessly about them,
Well, you've certainly specialised by the sounds of it.
If you're on Mastermind, we know what your specialist subject is.
Yeah, how embarrassing it would be if I got the questions wrong there.
Well, how often do you learn something about Enfield that you just never knew that surprises you?
Quite a lot, actually. I wrote a story a few years ago about the first victory in a race on a Royal Enfield, which was in 1904 in Brighton. As it turned out, we actually won a road race in Ireland 2 months prior to this, a chap called J.P. Burney, a 200-mile road race, and he finished 45 minutes ahead of the next competitor. And I didn't know any of this. And this only came to light this year as his great-granddaughter and various members of the vintage motorcycle community in Ireland are actually recreating the ride. And I've been given access to all the family photographs and history around that, and it's absolutely fascinating. So yeah, constantly there are things coming up. But to be honest, I do spend a lot of my time also fact-checking and correcting made-up history. People doing, a random search on the internet and then making up wonderful stories and glorifying things. Sometimes you would think we've won TT a dozen times.
One thing I did see on the internet whilst researching was the Project Origin, which was a nut and bolt reproduction of a 1901 Enfield. That looked incredible.
It's been such a joy to be a part of that. I'm very lucky in that I get to ride this incredible machine and talk to people about it and demonstrate it. It came about in 2020 in lockdown. We did a series of talks once a week on the Royal Enfield platform as a way of keeping all of our teams around the world linked together. A lot of people working from home for the first time, and then invite different people to come talk about different things.
It looks like a bicycle.
It's basically a stout bicycle with a fuel tank and an engine. So I did a talk on the early history of Royal Enfield and finished in 1901. At the end of the talk, I threw down a challenge to the young engineers working at our UK and India Technology Centre, saying, I've searched for one of these 1901 original first ever Royal Enfields for the best part of 30 years. I don't believe any have survived, so here's the challenge. How about we build a faithful working replica? Never expecting it to go any further. And once I finished the history talk, within 2 minutes, my phone was ringing, and it was Simon Warburton, at the time head of product development, saying, Gordon, let's do it. Let's get a team together, and why don't we try to make it so that it's part of our 120th anniversary celebrations? So a team of volunteers, this was a passion project. It was all done with people's weekends and evenings. I guess the first 6 months were research. We found that we knew so little about pioneer motorcycles motorcycling. We were blessed to have the support from members of the very small but passionate pioneer motorcycle community. They taught us a lot. We started in CAD because, of course, that's where everything is done these days. But we didn't have any blueprints to go off. We had no technical drawings at all. It was just a couple of photographs and a few advertisements. And that's all we had to go with.
Have you never come across so much as a frame of the original bike?
Not at all. We do have, as well, a 1901 Royal Enfield quadricycle on display at our UK Technology Centres. That was useful. I managed to track down a 1900 Royal Enfield bicycle and borrow that, which again was useful. But in essence, we took the best photograph we had and we knew the diameter of the wheels. So we projected it onto a wall and got the size right from the diameter of those wheels and then scaled everything off from that point onwards. We are blessed to have Harris Performance as part of our group, so they did the frame for us. The engine was completely built from scratch. Again, it's got an atmospheric inlet valve, mechanical exhaust valve. It's total loss oil. We had so much to learn. The inlet tract is about 18 inches long and the carburetor's way down low. You get icing on the inlet when you try to start it, unless you've got sunshine on it. In winter in the UK, we've actually resorted to pouring boiling water on tea towels and wrapping that around the carb. It's that Longermeyer carburetor.
Can you just give me a brief explanation, because Clive will have no idea what this means, what total loss oil?
I know what that is. Do you want me to explain it?
No, I don't.
It's where you don't have a mechanical, oil pump that self-lubricates, that doesn't go around a system. So it has you basically hand pump the oil into it. Bit of an art, really, because you always put in too much and then it smokes like billy-o. And then eventually after a mile, it's running clean and it's beautiful and you feel really good. And then after 3 or 4 miles, you start to get anxious, nip up soon. So you give it another squirt. And of course, it's okay to give it a squirt of oil when you're stationary. That's quite easy to do. But when you're riding along, controlling this, the engine actually on this motorcycle, should say, is ahead of the steering head above the front wheel. So you can imagine what its center of gravity is like. And you're trying to ride along and pump this oil by hand into the crankcases against crankcase compression. It takes a lot of thinking about how you ride this.
All that, and it's still got a better range than an electric.
There's no throttle. There's no clutch. There's one gear. It goes full speed, full power the whole time. And I've had it up at 32 miles an hour. And I can tell you at that speed, it's pretty darn scary on a band brake at the front. And you have to control the speed, especially if you want to turn, by using the valve lifter, which is right-hand operated. Your front brake's left-hand operated. You use the valve lifter to cut the engine and then let it back start again. So you're constantly blipping the engine to slow down because it's an atmospheric inlet valve, of course. So it just cuts out and then restarts. And also it's got a long belt from the pulley at the front of the engine all the way to the rear wheel. It's about 10 foot long, which is crossed over, and you can slacken the tension on that a little bit, which again allows you to slow down to make a tight turn. Otherwise it will throw you off. It really does take a lot of concentration.
I'm beginning to see why they disappeared.
Yeah, this was an era when every 6 months designs would change. All these engineers were taking inspiration from each other. Yeah, they were right at the forefront of things here in the UK.
I think the first Bullet was 1932, wasn't it?
It came as a 250, 350 and a 500. Sloper engine, foot change gearboxes, which were pretty much state of the art.
But it had exposed valves.
It did, yeah.
How does that work?
You just got to squirt grease on them.
Don't the cylinders get scarred and things?
No, it tends to be that the valve seats will wear out quite quickly. The valve guides, the valves themselves. It doesn't seem to get through to the cylinders.
Does your mechanical background just come from owning an Enfield?
Exactly.
Character building.
It comes largely from restoring them, although I have a friend who's an engineer who is absolutely meticulous and he does the engines for me. I started off just like a Meccano, bolting the bits together that he'd done superb work with. But then when I began making these overland journeys, I'd have mechanical challenges somewhere. I'd have to sort it. And I've learnt by having to deal with problems on the road.
It's necessity, isn't it? And this is one of the downsides, in a way, you could say, of modern technology, isn't it? Nobody knows how to fix anything because, in a way, they don't really need to fix anything as much.
I agree with that. In Khartoum, in Sudan, I burnt out some clutch plates. I got parts sent out, and I remember sitting there patiently for a day doing all this, and people kept coming up to me and saying, I recommend a mechanic to you. And I thought, they're just not going to know where to begin with this. You can't plug it into a diagnostic tool and fix it. And so I am not a mechanic, but I began calling myself a mechanic just to stop people insisting they take me to a mechanic. And a similar thing happened riding into Jerusalem, which is up this huge like a mountain, which I went up at rush hour on a Friday night and again destroyed the clutch plates. So I was at the roadside letting those cool down, and some very kind motorist who was crawling past phoned up a mobile motorcycle repair service for me without asking me if I wanted this. And this guy showed up on a motorcycle with all these panniers full of tools and spare parts on the side and said, I've been phoned to come and help you. And he looked at me and he said, I can't help you. And off he went.
What sort of things go wrong on old vintage British bikes then? It's presumably not everything you can fix by the roadside.
How long have we got?
As long as you need.
But I carry so many spare parts.
What do you need to be really good at to own an Enfield, would you say?
A vintage Enfield.
Yeah.
They're very, very simple to work on. I think I'm just very methodical and slow. I don't think you need to be very good at particularly anything. You just need to be methodical and have a basic understanding. You never have the part that you want or need, but DHL comes to the rescue. So what kind of mechanical problems? Well, I always carry a piston and piston rings.
A piston?
Yeah, I got through 3 pistons on the Bantam.
Jesus.
Wow, that's amazing.
I got through 2 pistons on the Matchless, cylinder head gasket. You know, I used to carry lots of spare nuts and bolts and washers thinking they'd vibrate off. They just end up with this black mess as they all rub together. And
We're with you on the nuts and bolts.
what else? Oh gosh, you've got me. I was obviously chain links, points. Funnily enough, I got to Jordan and I was decoking the piston actually in Jordan, and this guy came up to me and he said, "Is that a DKW? 9. It's a BSA Bantam." And it was my lucky day actually, because not only was he a passionate motorcycle traveller on 2 strokes, he was also a lecturer on motorcycle mechanics in a German college, and he rode MZs.
There's always someone worse off than yourself, isn't there?
And he looked at my decoke tool and he said, I decoke at the side of the road using spit and soil, but when I can, I use toothpaste. The American brands work best. Wait there. And he charged off to his hotel room and he came back with this tube of Nasher whitener and began polishing the top of the dome of my piston, and it worked brilliantly. I was telling him about all the heat seizures I'd had, and he said, he sort of scratched his chin and looked at this really solid, weighty, broad front mudguard that's on the D1 Bantam, and he said, "Tell me, why are you traveling across the desert with this big, heavy front mudguard? Do you think it's going to rain?" So we took the front mudguard off, and actually
Just improved the airflow, right?
It did. I strapped it onto the back of the Bantam. It really was overloaded by this point. From there, riding through Jordan and Syria and then into Europe, I never had another heat seizure.
One does have to ask the question, though, why he'd set off on a 1952 BSA Bantam from Manchester to Egypt.
It's not the kind of motorcycle that you would want to do that
And
on.
not comfortable?
No, very comfortable. I love that Bantam. You know, many people said to me, I would have thrown that Bantam into a ditch and hitchhiked away. And I'd say, I love that bike. And also, I know how lucky I am that every day I'm riding on one of these journeys, there are tens of thousands of motorcyclists around the world who'd give anything to have the opportunity that I have. And so whenever there's a problem, whether it be mechanical or any other kind of issue when traveling, that's just part of the journey and I embrace it.
Yeah, you have got to learn to relish it, haven't you, really? I've had a battery issue on my bike in the last few days of this trip to Portugal, and I kind of enjoyed the challenge of that a little bit. As a younger man, I would have been so stressed about that. Now I kind of I laugh in the face of things like that now.
And slightly different to what you did with your excellent preparation before you go having engine rebuilds. Noel had a 6-year-old battery which he thought was dead. And I said, look, these batteries last 6 years, replace it before you go. Did he? No.
When things go wrong, we're talking mechanically here, but it can be any other kind of issue. It's all about your mindset because it creates an opportunity. For me, travel it's wonderful to be able to ride a motorcycle every day. Sure. Travel, is all about the people that you meet and you experience and the cultures, and something going wrong gives you an opportunity to meet somebody and something great to happen that wouldn't have happened otherwise.
It often crops up, doesn't it, Claire? It's a big part of somebody's story of a trip is the thing that went wrong and what they had to do. So you're absolutely right. Yeah, it does make a trip.
It's always that magic of people just being very kind, doing things for free, looking after you, people staying in people's houses for days while parts arrive and things like that. Everybody we talk to has a story like that. It's quite amazing. Coming back to Royal Enfield, now obviously Mark Wells told us a little bit of the move of Royal Enfield to India. We probably don't need to dwell on that so much, but that was basically they got contracts from the Indian military, didn't they? And they ended up shipping
CKD bikes out there, yeah. Kit bikes from Redditch, yes.
Exactly, to be built out there, and that just grew and grew, and Royal Enfield became synonymous with India, I guess. And maybe that answers the question, really, that why is the passion for Royal Enfield so strong in India? Because it is the bike in India, right? Everybody wants one.
Yeah. Back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, it was the largest capacity home-built motorcycle. And it was a protected market until sometime in the 80s. People aspired to own one. If you own a Bullet in that era, you had made it. You were somebody. And people remember that. There's this thing in India where a generational love of Royal Enfields, where the grandfather had one and the father and now the son has one. It's passed down through the generations. It starred in Bollywood films. Businessmen had it. And of course, there's this real passion in India for the Indian Armed Forces right through to this day. And so that association remains really, really strong. Most of the time in India, it has changed recently, but for most of its life in India, people will call Royal Enfield the Bullet Company because it's bullets that we've been known for and have continually manufactured there, to the point where head of industrial design in India, Siva, his first day working at Royal Enfield in 2005, he wasn't riding a Royal Enfield to the factory, but his bike that he was riding broke down. So he had to catch an auto rickshaw to take him to the factory. He kept saying, Royal Enfield, take me to Royal Enfield, Tiruvatia. And the rickshaw driver didn't have a clue where to take him. Siva had to direct him. And when he got there, the rickshaw driver said, it's Bullet Company. Why didn't you say?
So they've obviously caught something with the modern bikes that they're building, which are very close nod to Royal Enfields of old. It's not just in India that they're popular around the world, aren't they? I mean, it's one of the best-selling, but I think 4 of the top 10 best-selling bikes in the UK are Royal Enfields at the moment, and that's some of it's down to price. But is it more than the fact that bike riders are very much gentlemen around our age that are harking back to the glory days of the 50s, or do you think there is something more to it than that? And I'm asking you that question because we've been talking about heritage, and that's obviously incredibly important to Royal Enfield.
I think in the 90s and early 2000s, it was the born-again biker. It was gentlemen of our age that would be looking at and buying Royal Enfields. And sure, some of those still do. We are attracting a much younger audience now as well, as we're bringing out motorcycles like the Hunter, which is a really nippy, agile 350, which is great in cities and also appeals, to riders who are not quite tall enough for, say, a Himalayan, whereas, and a lot of women riders are finding like the Meteor 350 and the Hunter really popular choices. So no, we are definitely appealing to a younger audience now as well.
Can the Woodsman come back, and can it be put down as my idea? Come on. I mean, that'd be great to see that again. It always sticks in my mind, the Woodsman. I think perhaps the name appealed to me, but...
The Woodsman, it's quite a strange little bit of our history. So when Indian of Springfield went bust in, 53? It was Brockhouse Engineering, a British company, that bought out the rights to it. And they thought, if we can get some British motorcycles and badge them as Indian, we can flog them around the existing dealer network in the States. And the Royal Enfield range was chosen to do that. And the bikes were, obviously they were badged as Indian, and there were a few tweaks, whether it was the seat or the handlebars, just to give them that more American feel. And quite a few of them were styled as off-road bikes, desert racers, scramblers, and the Woodsman was sort of like a trials come desert kind of look to it, with a high bars and a high rise exhaust system. And that went on for 5 years, that agreement. And the Woodsman in particular, it was a 500 bullet, basically, sold very well. And a lot of them have been brought back into the UK and restored by enthusiasts here. And quite a few people have bought Indian as in Chennai built Royal Enfields, modern ones, personalised them or customised them to look like those Indians of the 1950s. What always makes me smile is that back in 1955, started this arrangement with Brockhouse making Indians, and we also opened the factory in India. In 1955, it must have been very confusing. Royal Enfields were made in India, and Royal Enfield began making Indians. Must have been, some people to get their heads around that. It must have been quite funny.
Is it going to happen? And is somebody going to claim it as their idea? And yet again,
Mark Wells will totally listen to this and he'll go, yeah, I've designed this. Let's call it a Woodsman.
He's going to steal it. Another idea stolen.
I might delete that. We'll see how we go. You've done a number of trips, quite big trips. You've mentioned a few of them so far. You've been to India, Egypt on the Bantam, you've been to Vietnam, and I think one of the last big trips you did was from Manchester to Cape Town via Nordkap.
Yeah, so the idea was to get to the most northern point in Europe, accessible by road, down to the most southern point of Africa, which was on a 1952 Royal Enfield 500 twin, which was a really lovely bike.
The first question is, why didn't you just get a nice, reliable Honda?
For me, and there's nothing wrong with nice, reliable Hondas, or any motorcycle, doesn't matter what motorcycle you choose, it's the right motorcycle for you. But for me, my passion has always been with these older classic bikes. It took a lot of maintenance to keep that bike going. Not that it was going wrong, it just was a slow process maintaining it virtually every day, but I never regretted taking it. It was a lovely bike to ride, really smooth, sweet engine.
Yeah, a friend of ours let me have a go on his BSA. I think it was a 350 BSA from the 1950s. It had me grinning from ear to ear. It did actually feel fantastic to ride. And I think until you've ridden something like that, you can't really explain to people why they're quite so unique. It's the character of the engine. It's the way that the bikes are kind of maybe a little bit longer and stretched out, and the handling's a little bit lazy, but they just feel really, really nice, don't they?
And there's a real sense of accomplishment every day or every hill, or on the Matchless, going through Tajikistan on the Pamir Highway, where it was corrugated up at 4,000 meters, and it's just you and the bike. The sense of achievement was fantastic.
I was having this conversation with Simon last week about corrugations, because he's been in Africa, and he was telling me, and I've had corrugations in Iceland where I knew that somebody had told me you've got to hit a certain speed and you find a sweet spot where in theory you sail over the ridges of the corrugations. Did you do that?
Are you kidding? On a World War II Matchless with a rigid rear end?
Exactly.
Not on your life. I just had to crawl, and it was so painful. 30-kilometre stretches at a time.
Oh, it's a horrible feeling, isn't it?
It is, yeah. There's no way I could get up to those speeds. Sometimes it was really tough going, but the scenery in Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan was absolutely magnificent.
So which of the trips that you've done are the sort of the most memorable or the most enjoyable?
I cannot say which were and which weren't. In 87, we bought a 350 Bullet in Delhi and spent 5 months riding around India and Nepal with it, and that was in a time where there weren't tourists doing that, and the adventure motorcycle scene wasn't really anything compared with what it is today. That was fantastic. Every trip's been wonderful. And I've been really blessed in recent times through Royal Enfield to have been able to make some, great rides on new bikes. So last November, a fellow overland traveller and author, Jackie Furneaux, who spent 7 years riding her Royal Enfield around the world, and we grabbed a couple of bullets in Chennai and rode them from that coast across to the other coast to Goa for the Motorverse event, and then travelled up into Maharashtra. And that was just as fantastic as taking a 1953 bullet from the UK to India. It was really a fabulous journey.
So you've been kickstarting bikes, presumably?
All my life.
How are your hips?
Fine. It's all technique.
Is it? Because I had to kickstart my quad bike today because the battery was flat. Again, battery issues. And it nearly killed me trying to kickstart it. You're praying, please let it fire on the next one. You've built up some resistance to this. Oh, well, it's technique, as you say.
Technique, and also, it's got to be set up right as well. The ignition timing's got to be spot on, and your points have got to be set right and clean, and so everything's got to be set up properly as well.
Points, Clive. Do you remember points?
I do. I was looking only the other day at buying some new ones for my little Honda. I've been researching wiring harnesses and how you make them and how you plan them, and you get a board and you sort of put the frame of your bike against, and you can draw the frame so you can work out what the length of the wire you need to make it and then what endings you need. And I'm thinking I'll just buy all new electrics, build a wiring loom, and as I was looking for parts, I found that you can get a complete wiring loom for my little Honda for 35 quid. I'm probably not going to do that now. How long were your trips, Gordon, on average? Were you looking at, a year, 6 months?
Oh, gosh, no, never anything like that. So the ride down to Nordkap to Cape Town was just over 4 months, I think. The ride to Vietnam was about 101, 102 days. Obviously being limited, being self-employed at those times to how long I could be away for. But I would always take time off on the journeys. I'm not riding every single day. The Matchless 40 miles an hour the whole way, as was the Bantam. So you just spend time in the saddle and just take it gently and easily.
Has your enthusiasm for big trips waned a little with age?
No, it hasn't. But obviously now being employed rather than self-employed, that has curtailed the possibilities. But on the other hand, I get the opportunity to ride new bikes in beautiful countries. I was out in Australia in February riding. I was in the States a couple of times last year riding with work. And I am so blessed to have the opportunity to ride these new motorcycles, whether that's on my own or with friends or with colleagues.
I'm just thinking what position I can engineer for myself at Royal Enfield. Is there anyone there to make the tea? I'm happy to start at the bottom.
That is where you'd be.
I know my place.
I guess travelling on the vintage bikes makes you much more approachable as well when you are travelling through various countries, because people tend to be more interested in the vintage than the new, do you think?
People are interested in them, but there's very little knowledge of what they actually are. And I think, to be honest, that as a motorcycle traveller, especially as a solo motorcycle traveller, people are really open and receptive to you anyway. I always wear an open face crash helmet because I think that's a good way for people to immediately see who they're dealing with when you come to stop. I think to a certain extent, when you're on your own on a motorcycle and you're in a remote area where tourists don't go, people know you're vulnerable. And I think it brings out the best in people. I really do. I've had nothing but the most wonderful encounters with strangers on the road. As a motorcyclist, whatever I'm riding, I don't think it would have made any difference whether I was on a World War II motorcycle or a new motorcycle. I think it's all about how you connect with people, how you present yourself, how you treat them.
Did you ever have any moments on the old bikes where things went wrong and you just couldn't make progress with some outside help, or you had to order parts or anything like that?
Oh yeah, I've had to order parts. I had gearbox selector mechanism was very problematic on the Matchless, and I kept getting stuck in first gear and neutral, and I'd spend 2 hours at the roadside getting very greasy hands bodging it, and then I'd ride for a day and to do it again. So I had to get a replacement sent out to me. Azerbaijan, I got that. And then I fit it in correctly. To cross the Caspian Sea to Turkmenistan, there's no ferries. You had to find a berth on a freighter. The day the part arrived, I fit it, and I set off for the port because I had a berth on this freighter and found I only had 3 gears. So the next day in Turkmenistan, I was there doing it all over again. Clutch plates, in Africa. I had to have sent out pistons to Libya.
That's the name of the book, isn't it? Pistons to Libya.
The pistons to Libya left a village in Leicestershire on a Friday lunchtime. They went via Belgium, Dubai, to Tripoli, and I had them on the Sunday morning.
Wow.
All the way from the 1950s.
When I rode the 53 Bullet, which is obviously British built, I had to go through Turkey, Iran, Pakistan. And so I needed a carnet de passage for that for Iran and Pakistan. And when I got to the Indian customs, so I got stamped into the country, but the Indian customs officer was asleep at his desk and I didn't dare wake him. And I sat there for about an hour until he sort of snored too loud and woke himself up. And he was a bit grumpy. We went outside for him to check my paperwork against the bike. And he sort of checked the frame number and the engine number, and he looked at my carnet and he said, "Oh, I'm very sorry, your paperwork is wrong. You can't bring this bike into India." And I said, "Why?" Because I knew it was right. I'd used it in Iran and Pakistan. And he said, "Well, it says here your motorcycle is a Royal Enfield Bullet." And I said, "Yes." And he said, "And it says here the country of manufacturer is United Kingdom." And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Oh, no. Royal Enfield Bullets are made in India. Your paperwork is wrong. You cannot bring this motorcycle into India."
Did you get your Royal Enfield Historian business card out?
I put my historian hat on before I'd been given that lofty title. And yes, eventually I was let in. I think a lot of the challenges, though, are not about the bikes themselves. I mean, I was in an earthquake in Pakistan, which was quite horrendous on the Karakoram highway going through a tribal area in Pakistan where the roads were in terrible condition. I was so lucky. For the first time, I had a helmet camera on and I came around this bend and I could see across the river Indus this whole embankment collapsing. But to my eye, I didn't realize it was an earthquake. It looked like a giant mud waterfall. So I stopped the match list because the helmet camera was locked and I needed my right hand to unlock it. And as I did that, I could hear all these rifle shots and see all these rocks pouring down around me and great big clouds of dust as they were coming down the hillside. And I think that saved my life. 200 meters ahead, there was a 40 meter stretch that was just completely obliterated by rock. Another 200 meters ahead of that, there was a pickup truck. 5 people were killed in that. There were, I think, 170 people killed on the Karakoram highway that day.
Had you felt it as you were riding?
No, I was on a 350 single.
It's always an earthquake, yeah.
I ended up sleeping in a police station for the next two different police stations for the next 2 nights because of road closures and because of the threat of terrorism on that particular road at night time. I was on a charpoy, a rope bed, nothing else in the room, very, very basic. And outside there was just complete silence, and I was just so grateful to have that sanctuary because I knew there'd be hundreds of people trapped between rock slides, some of them injured, some of them frightened. And, I was alive and safe and I had a bed, basic as it was. Treated, quite wonderfully by the Pakistan police.
So that obviously stands out as one of your closest shaves, I would imagine.
Definitely. I think that it's quite likely that helmet camera saved my life. I've had the works. I was hospitalized in Peshawar in Pakistan, God knows what with. I was down to about 7.5 stone. You could see all the ribs up my back. This was in 87. I've had giardia 3 times. I've had meningitis. I came back from India once. Did a coffee table book in 2005 to celebrate 50 years of production in India. And I came back from the factory with meningitis straight into Stockport Hospital. Most recently, last year, I was out launching the new Bullet 350 in September. And when I came back, I felt a bit odd the second night. And I came down with dengue fever. And I was in hospital with that. I'd never felt so poorly in all my life. I felt more poorly with dengue than I did with meningitis. Totally debilitating. But luckily, I don't seem to crash and break things.
Swings and roundabouts. So you have written, by my count, 7 books?
I think so. There's a box set of 4 books I wrote as part of Royal Enfield's 120th anniversary celebrations as well, but they're not available for sale here. So the 7 plus those.
You've got a series of books on the history of Royal Enfield, and like you said, back in 2001, the Made in India book, and then you followed that up with 3 other books in the history, and then there's the books about your travels, the Overland to India, Overland to Egypt, Overland to Vietnam. Where can people buy those books?
Each of those books should have its own website. You can get them on royalenfieldbooks.com. Or if you're in India, you can get them on, because they've been published in India too, them on Royal Enfield Gift Store.
We're quite popular in India.
Oh, yeah. Enthusiasm in India for motorcycling is just unbelievable. The event we have out in Goa every year, which used to be called Rider Mania, it's now called Motorverse. The atmosphere there amongst the riders who treat it as a kind of pilgrimage to go to it, the atmosphere is incredible.
So a massive thanks as always to our guest, Gordon G. May, Royal Enfield historian. Much appreciated. Some great stories. I think we probably need to get Gordon back on and to talk about some of his travels throughout the world. On a different subject, if you haven't already and you plan to enter the Rydale Rally, get your entry in. They're filling up. It'll be great to see you. And put your team name down as TAMP Podcast. Right. I've got a few episodes to edit. I'm a bit behind on editing stuff going on at work and at home, but we'll get there. Got some amazing guests lined up. Stick with us. We'll be back next week. See you then. Thanks for listening. We really appreciate your support. Don't forget you can follow us on Facebook and Instagram. And if you really appreciate what we do, you could consider supporting us on Patreon or buy us a coffee. Links are available on our website, which is tampodcast.com, tampodcast.com, where we also have a limited selection of branded stuff. But either way, please keep listening and spreading the word. See you next time.